As Donald Trump himself has said during this campaign, he's not on the ticket, he's not on the ballot, but at the same time, he is really.
Well, it's clearly, as any kind of midterm election, a referendum on the president. 2010 was a referendum on Barack Obama. 1994 was a referendum on Bill Clinton. And so it goes with every midterm election. It's about the voters evaluating, judging the first 2 years of the term, the legislation that was passed, the presidential action, and not so much his foreign policy, but essentially his domestic policy, but also his style. But it's another kind of referendum because we've seen so much violence in the rhetoric. We've seen some proposals that were clearly out of the pale, beyond the mainstream of what is acceptable or even possible in constitutional terms, such as the idea that the president could just strike down with an executive order the fact that all persons who are born in the United States become U.S. citizens, which is in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which would then need to be amended. All those things mean that we're talking about a constitutional referendum, not just a legislative referendum, on what the First Amendment means, what the Second Amendment about the right to bear arms means in the wake of the tragedy in Pittsburgh. What the checks and balances mean in terms of how an imperial president who's becoming an authoritarian executive is emerging, and how this power is not really checked by Congress or by the Supreme Court at this particular point in time. So it's a referendum on the president. But that's the case for all midterm elections. But it's also a much more important referendum on what the Constitution of the United States means.
And Donald Trump during this campaign has been omnipresent. He's really been going all over the country campaigning for various people. How unusual is that for the president to be so present on the campaign trail?
Well, actually, there are precedents. In 2002, President Bush was very much involved in the midterms, so involved that actually, for the first time in a very long period, the governing party, the party that was in the White House, the Republican Party in that case, actually won the midterms, which is a fluke when traditionally the party that's in the White House loses seats in Congress in the midterms.
What about voter enthusiasm? Early voting has been huge. How unusual is that? I mean, is this electorate particularly motivated?
Yes. Clearly, what we're seeing are signs of great enthusiasm on both sides of the political aisle. But we have to be very wary of early voting because, yes, it could mean that voters are very interested in the election, but it could also mean that voters are taking more advantage of that ability which is given to them in more and more states to vote earlier at a time of their convenience on a day which is better for them. So let's be careful about this. But at the same time, most political analysts are predicting that voter turnout is not going to be the usual 35 to 40% that we have in the midterms, but closer to 55, and we might even reach presidential election years turnout around 60%. So that would be something absolutely extraordinary, and that would be due to the great violence, but also the stakes of a very important election.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and your analysis, Vincent Michelot.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.